Hi, welcome. This is video 30 on wastewater treatment. And so when we flush water down the sink or use the toilets or use our shower, a lot of that water is going to be returned to a wastewater treatment facility. And what they're going to do there is they're going to do a combination of physical, chemical, and biological processes to turn that wastewater back into safe water that can go on to the ecosystem or back to the environment. And so a couple of different things that are going to go into this. The treatment for household water is pretty standard. If it's coming from industry, though, it'll usually be treated at the plant for whatever specifically they're using the water for, and that'll filter out some of those things that typical wastewater treatment won't get rid of. And so this is the whole process here. There are a couple different sections we're going to break it down to: the primary treatment, secondary treatment, and then tertiary treatment. This section here is kind of optional, and I think it's only 2% of the United States actually go through tertiary treatment, but almost everywhere it goes primary, secondary. In the whole world grand scheme of things, primary is pretty common and not as much secondary, but in the US we are very good with our secondary wastewater treatment. And so this general picture here is how it works. The water is going to come in, we're going to filter out the really large pieces of stuff, and then we're going to kind of let it settle and clarify, and then the sludge is going to be drawn out and kind of sent away. We're going to then aerate it, and once it's aerated again, we're going to let it clarify again, and we're going to remove more of that sludge from the bottom, and then we're going to disinfect it. And there's a couple different ways we can do that, but that's essentially wastewater treatment. We're going to get a little more in detail there. And so the pre-treatment, this is before it's actually running through the facility. We are running it through to remove really big pieces of stuff. Wastewater is defined as anything that can be shoved through a 4-inch diameter pipe. And so bigger things that make it in, like pieces of wood or like toys and rings, anything like that, is going to be drawn out through this called a bar screen. And it's all mechanical. Essentially, you've got a big screen here with this diameter holes in it. And these bars draw up over the surface, and anything that's caught by the screen gets scraped up by the bars, dumped into a dumpster, and we can pitch it out in a landfill. The water after going through pre-treatment is just going to be kind of devoid of these really large, unusual objects from it, but it's not really been treated yet. Primary treatment, the very first thing we do is strictly mechanical, and so this is essentially letting it settle out. And so we bring the inflow into this very large tank. We're going to pump it in through the bottom here, and we've got a arm that rotates, and this rotating arm is going to continually move the sludge that's on the bottom here, the really large suspended solids that settle out over time, into a sludge digester, and it's going to be transferred on to a different step. The clear stuff around the top, you can see it's got to kind of pass through this kind of filter device here, and the clear water is going to be able to move on to secondary treatment. And so we filter out a lot of different things here. We're going to be able to remove the heavier than water substances like the sand and the grit and the dirt, the organic material in this wastewater. And we're also going to be able to pull out anything that floats in it here as well, like the grease and the oil. The stirring and mixing of this water is going to lead to aeration, bringing air into the water and disrupting the surface, which typically makes this the smelly part. A strong odor is going to be present here. A lot of those sulfide-containing bacteria, so kind of that rotten egg smell. The stuff that we get out of this is the sludge to the digesters. They're simply going to be held in these heating silos and be allowed to kind of break down the bacteria. The decomposers are going to do that over time. And this is essentially the majority of the world's wastewater treatment. It kind of ends here, but there's still a lot of stuff left in this water, although much clearer. We go through a secondary treatment process, which looks like this. And so it's the biological treatment. And what happens, here's our settling tank from primary. After that settling tank, we really heavily aerate it. And this aeration is done to bring oxygen into the mix. And that oxygen is good for the bacteria here that live in the sludge. It's kind of like a proprietary cocktail of different bacteria to break down this organic waste, but they all need oxygen, and so that oxygen is going to let them break down that waste, and it's going to settle out those larger particles, and again we can remove that. The sludge that we get out of secondary treatment kind of goes one of two ways. It can be recycled back through, and you need to do that to kind of reseed these tanks with fresh, good bacteria. Some of that is going to get pumped and sent into a digester, and then eventually that will be dried out. And once it's dried out, this makes a very effective fertilizer for crops and stuff, or it can simply be disposed of in a landfill. So you get kind of one or the other here. After we go through the settling tank, it goes on. When we get here to the secondary treatment, the water still contains 30% of the original suspended solids and 70% of the biological oxygen demand. Those are the bacteria in the water. And so in the countries that don't go through secondary treatment, they're leaving a lot of stuff in the water, and we're not really spitting out clean water yet. There is some more steps that we can go through, and tertiary treatment is that step. And so this is an optional setup, but we do it for a couple different reasons. We can remove unwanted bacteria, we can remove nitrates or phosphates. And so, as you know, these two are linked with eutrophication, and that's the primary reason why we want to remove them. The first one, though, is disinfection, and this is always going to be the last step. So we might do nitrates, we might do phosphates, but we're definitely going to disinfect at the very end. And there's a couple different ways. One of them is through chlorine. We can move chlorine through the water. It's very cheap. It's really common to do. The problem is at the end of it, we have to dechlorinate again because chlorine is harmful to the aquatic organisms. So we can't just pump out that chlorine-containing water. So we got to remove that at the end. UV is picking up, especially over in Europe. This one is very popular. The UV is an ultraviolet light, and so that light is going to be harmful to the genetic structure of those pathogens, and it will break down their DNA and prevent them from living. It'll kill them. And so the nice things with that is that it does not leave anything in the water that we have to remove, like chlorine did. But the problem is that it's more expensive because the maintenance and the replacement of the lamps cost money. And to do this, you need to have very clear water, because if there's still particles suspended in the water, then those pathogens can survive in kind of the shadows that they would cast. The third step is ozone. Ozone is a very reactive oxidizer, and it'll destroy the microorganisms, and we can generate it on site with using oxygen in the air and high voltage systems. Nice thing with ozone is that unlike chlorine, there's no tanks of ozone sitting around. We generate it as we need it, and so by doing so, we get a kind of constant supply without storing a hazardous chemical. Where those chlorine tanks, they sit on the property, they could rupture and leak and cause environmental disasters. Ozone costs more, though, because you need money to generate that high voltage system, and so there's trade-offs one way or another there. The first type of tertiary treatment is going to be our nitrogen removal, and so we can remove nitrogen in a couple of different ways, but the main goal here is by using the nitrogen cycle. We want to try to turn that ammonia, essentially the P, into nitrate, and so the way we're going to do that is by heavily oxygenating the water. And so you can see that process down here below. There's a lot of aeration going on, a lot of stirring of the water. The more oxygen we get in, the more ammonia becomes nitrate. And remember, nitrate is NO2, so we need 2 oxygen atoms for every nitrogen atom. After that, we're going through denitrification of the nitrates, and so this is going to occur in an anoxic environment, and what we're going to have is bacteria growing without the presence of oxygen. And what the bacteria are going to do is they're actually going to rip the oxygen off of the nitrogen, and that is going to leave behind N2 gas, which is harmless, and it'll float up into the atmosphere. So that's how we get rid of the nitrogen. The other important thing to remove are the phosphates, and we can remove phosphates in 2 different ways. Biologically is the first way, through what are called polyphosphate accumulating organisms, specifically the bacteria. These things are going to store up to 20% of their mass in phosphate from their environment, and so we can grow these and eventually harvest them, and we can dehydrate them and sell them as fertilizers or send them straight to the landfills. The other way we can get rid of the phosphorus from the water is through chemical precipitation with either alum or lime. This is kind of costly because you have to buy these chemicals, whereas the bacteria, once you have a growth or population of bacteria, you can maintain it by continuing to feed them phosphates. The these chemicals you can't continue to reuse, and so you have to continue to purchase them and store them and that kind of stuff. A couple things: that wastewater treatment doesn't remove everything from the water, and so you can leave behind some potentially harmful chemicals. After we go through wastewater treatment, they can be sent back into the atmosphere or even enter the public's drinking water. And there's a lot of concern over this, despite there being a lot of testing. The good news is that this stuff is all in very low concentrations, and so it hasn't really become a big issue yet, although it's a worrisome one. And you can see some political cartoons devoted to this right here. This is particularly with the focus of birth controls in water. The issue is birth control is a hormone that prevents pregnancies, but it actually stays active in the water and can get transferred to fish because they live in the water. And that hormone can mess up the proportions of male and female fish in an ecosystem if there are a lot of people living nearby and you get a high amount of birth control in the water. Other things that people worry about getting in the water are pharmaceuticals. So a lot of the medicines that we take will get passed through the bodies and enter the wastewater treatment plants, and we can't remove those very easily, and we certainly don't do it in the modern wastewater treatment. And so the worry is that you could pick up other people's drugs and pharmaceuticals from drinking tap water. Household chemicals, pesticides, microplastics is a very interesting one right now as well, and these all lead to water pollution. The microplastics, this shows how they harvest them up here through these really fine nets they drag through the ocean, and that's kind of the outcome. So they're very small particles. There are two ways they can enter. They can enter it as primary microplastics in the form of microbeads in rinse-off cosmetics. Like if you go to Bed Bath & Beyond and you see the bottles of hand lotions and hand sanitizers that have those little tiny dots of stuff in them, colorful dots that are there for scrubbing purposes. Those are micro beads of plastic. They're essentially just waste plastic that they put into the product, and those get washed into wastewater treatment and they never get absorbed or taken out along the way, and so they are accumulating currently in the ocean. Microplastics can also come from secondary sources like a plastic bottle that breaks down through wave action, UV, or microbes, that kind of stuff. And so those particles then can be absorbed by fish and seabirds, and we're actually finding a lot of these in their stomachs and in their gills. One of the big problems with these microplastics, or big worries, I should say, with microplastics, is that they can pick up other chemicals from the ocean water, things like heavy metals or organic molecules that are harmful to fish and stuff. And then these things, these tiny little particles, can be mistaken as fish food by small fish, and they can be eaten and incorporated in their tissues, and then you can see bioaccumulation up the food chain. So it's kind of a blossoming field right now. A big time study is going on right now for the St. Johns River, even in terms of microplastics that are in our waters right here. So this is kind of cutting edge stuff, but it's a type of water pollution that there's no real easy solution for. And that's all I've got for you for our lecture here. Hope you have some notes and are ready to discuss tomorrow. Thank you for watching.